There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a room full of people when someone says something they all know is wrong. You can feel it pressing against the walls. You can feel the collective intake of breath, that fraction of a second when 47 human beings simultaneously register that what just happened should not have happened, that decency has been violated, that the social contract has been torn in two right in front of them. I know exactly what that silence sounds like. I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count. 3 seconds. That's how long it lasted. 3 full seconds of people understanding that the woman who had just walked through the door carrying a coffee service in a tailored charcoal blazer, the woman who had personally attended to the organization of at least 2 of their tax returns, who had hosted more than a dozen of them for Sunday roasts, who had sent handwritten Christmas cards to their home addresses for over a decade, that woman had just been introduced to the room as the help. 3 seconds. And then they laughed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the conference room, and what happened in it, and what happened because of it, none of that is where the story really begins. The story begins 26 years earlier, with a 29-year-old woman named Claire Morrison who had $45,000 in savings from her grandmother's estate, a business plan she'd worked on for 7 months, and a boyfriend named Simon who had a beautiful smile and absolutely no capital to speak of. I want you to hold on to that image for a moment. Young Claire, 29 years old, with all that careful money and all those careful plans, sitting across from Simon Hartwell in a solicitor's office in Leeds city centre, signing incorporation papers for a company she was about to fund into existence. She's excited. She's a little nervous. She believes in herself, and she believes in him, and she trusts him with her grandmother's money and her grandmother's faith in her and the future she's imagined for both of them. I want you to hold that image, because by the time this story is over, you're going to understand exactly how much was taken from that young woman. And you're going to understand why, when it was finally time to take it back, I didn't hesitate for a single moment. I grew up in Headingley, the eldest of 3 girls. My mother was a primary school teacher in Leeds for 31 years. My father managed a building supplies warehouse until his back gave out when I was 15, after which my mother carried the family almost entirely alone, with a grace and a dignity that I have spent most of my adult life trying to understand. We weren't poor exactly, but we were careful. Everything was accounted for. Treats were deliberate and appreciated. Money was never wasted, and waste was considered a moral failing as much as a practical one. My mother taught us, by example rather than by lecture, that competence was something you cultivated in silence and then deployed when needed. She never complained about the extra shifts, the parents' evenings that ran until 9, the marking she did at the kitchen table after we'd gone to bed. She simply did what needed doing, with a thoroughness that made the doing look effortless, and I absorbed that lesson so completely that I didn't realize until I was much older that effortlessness is itself a performance, that the invisibility of good work is not proof that the work is easy, but proof that the person doing it is skilled enough to make it appear so. I was a good student, not brilliant in the flashy way, not the kind who put up their hand first or who teachers talked about in the staff room. I was the kind who got things right consistently, who completed every assignment with the same careful attention whether it was assessed or not, who understood at 15 that the purpose of learning was not the grade, but the knowing. My secondary school maths teacher, a woman named Mrs. Fairbrother, who was about as warm as a January morning, and whom I came to adore for exactly that reason, told my mother at a parents' evening that I had a better grasp of systems and patterns than any student she'd taught in 12 years, but that I needed to stop letting the louder students in the class take credit for answers I'd worked out first. I thought about Mrs. Fairbrother a great deal later in life. My grandmother Elsie, my mother's mother, was the same. She'd worked as a seamstress from the age of 16 and saved with a ferocity that most people reserve for religion. When she died in 1996, she left $68,000 split between my mother and me. It was the most money I had ever seen in my life. My share was $45,000 $1,000, and I held it like something breakable, turning it over in my mind for a year before I decided what to do with it. Elsie had never gone to university. She'd never had the option. But she understood numbers with an instinctive precision that no formal education could have sharpened further. She kept a little notebook, a brown leather thing with gold corners that she called her reckoning book, in which she recorded every penny that came in and went out, annotated with the date and the reason, and sometimes a brief editorial comment in her neat, cramped handwriting. After she died, my mother found the book in the top drawer of her bedside table and gave it to me because she said Elsie would have wanted me to have it. I keep it still. I have never found a more honest document in my life. I had worked in business administration for 6 years by then. I understood supply chains, client management, financial reporting, contract structures. I had watched my bosses make decisions I could see more clearly than they could, and I had filed their paperwork and organized their correspondence and said nothing because that was the job. But the job had taught me something. I knew how a business worked. I knew how to build one. Those 6 years had been a very thorough education in the gap between the front of a business and its interior. I worked for 3 different companies in that period: a logistics firm in Wakefield, a small manufacturing consultancy in Leeds city center, and a medium-sized facilities management company in Harrogate, where I spent the longest stretch, nearly 3 years. In each of them, the pattern was broadly similar. Directors and managers occupied the visible positions, attended the client meetings, took the credit at the end of quarters, while a small army of administrative and organizational workers kept the actual machinery running without acknowledgement or visibility. I did not resent this at the time. I was young, I was learning, and I understood that you built credibility over time by doing the work well and being noticed for doing it well. What I did, quietly, was keep track. In a small notebook of my own, nothing as elegant as Elsie's, just a plain spiral-bound thing from W.H. Smith. I noted every process I improved, every error I caught before it became a crisis, every client relationship I maintained through someone else's neglect. Not for any immediate purpose, but because something in me, something trained by Elsie's reckoning book and my mother's kitchen table marking and Mrs. Fairbrother's precision, understood that a record kept is a truth preserved. Simon was, and I want to be fair about this because fairness matters even now, genuinely charismatic. He walked into a room and people leaned toward him. He told a story and people forgot they had somewhere else to be. He had this particular quality of attention, of making you feel for the duration of the conversation that you were the only interesting person he'd encountered all week, and it was intoxicating. I was 27 when we met, introduced by a mutual friend at a party in Roundhay, and I was not immune to it. Nobody was. What Simon did not have was business sense. He had energy and charm and an absolute certainty that he was meant for something larger. But when I actually reviewed what he'd tried to build before we met, a small events promotions venture that had dissolved after 8 months, what I found was a complete absence of structure. He'd been doing everything by instinct and hoping instinct would be enough. It never is. In the early months of our relationship, before I had begun to fully understand the way his mind worked, I had admired his confidence. There is something magnetic about a person who is absolutely certain they will succeed, who speaks about the future as though it is already arranged and simply waiting to be inhabited. Simon spoke like that. He'd tell you about a business idea over dinner, and by the end of the evening, you'd feel as though it had already happened, as though the only administrative detail remaining was the paperwork. It took me about 4 months to realize that with Simon, the paperwork was always what was missing. He had genuinely good instincts about people and markets. He saw opportunities that others passed by, and he could articulate them persuasively enough to make other people see them too. But he couldn't construct the architecture that would translate those opportunities into something sustainable. He didn't know how to build a cost model or a client acquisition timeline or a contingency plan. He didn't know how to protect a good idea from itself. That was where I came in. I rewrote his entire approach. I built a proper business model. I identified the market gap, industrial equipment maintenance contracts for mid-size manufacturers in West Yorkshire, a sector that was being poorly served by the larger national providers and being gouged accordingly. I put together a 5-year projection, a client acquisition strategy, a cost structure. Simon looked at it, and something in his face shifted. A recognition that this was real, that this could actually work, that what he'd been missing all along was someone who could translate his energy into a sustainable plan. I remember the evening I laid it all out for him on the dining table of my flat in Chapel Allerton. 7 months of evenings and weekends, every page printed and labeled and organized in a ring binder I'd color-coded by section. He went through it with the absorbed attention of a student reading a text he needs to pass an exam on. And when he looked up after about an hour, his expression had something in it I hadn't seen from him before. Not the usual breezy confidence, but something quieter, something approaching genuine respect. "You built all this," he said. "We're going to build all this," I corrected. He nodded. And then he smiled, the beautiful smile, and said we should celebrate. We went out to dinner at a restaurant in the city center that was slightly beyond what either of us could comfortably afford, and I let myself be happy, and I was happy, genuinely, and without reservation, and I can look back at that evening now without bitterness, because it was a real thing, whatever came after. My excitement was real, my belief in the plan was real. The Prosecco we drank at the restaurant, and then later the cheaper version in the solicitor's car park when we'd signed the papers, was real and well-earned. I had built something worth believing in. We put the incorporation papers together in March 1998. Hartwell Industries. I contributed 45 SEOs. Simon contributed 12 SEOs, which he'd scraped together from a combination of savings and a loan from his older brother. The shareholder agreement was clear: 60% to me, 40% to him. He would manage day-to-day operations, the sales calls and client relationships, and the face of the company. I would handle the financial structure, the administrative backbone, the organization that would stop the whole thing collapsing under its own energy. We signed everything on a Tuesday afternoon. There was a bottle of cheap Prosecco. Simon kissed me in the solicitor's car park and said we were going to build something real. I believed him completely. Hartwell Industries grew. It grew the way things grow when the foundations are properly laid, steadily, without drama, accruing credibility year by year. Simon was a brilliant salesman. He was right about that much. He built relationships with clients who genuinely enjoyed dealing with him, who called him directly, who recommended him to colleagues. The front of the company shone. And behind the front, I worked. I organized the contract database, built the billing systems, handled the bookkeeping through the early years before the company was large enough for a dedicated accountant, managed the correspondence, tracked the maintenance schedules that were the core of the business model. When Simon forgot to follow up on an invoice, I followed up. When a contract clause needed reviewing, I reviewed it. When the company nearly folded in 2006 because 2 major clients left within 3 months of each other and cash flow became critical, it was my restructured payment terms and my renegotiated supplier contracts that held the thing together while Simon rebuilt the client list. The first years were intoxicating in the way that building things always is. There's a particular pleasure in watching something you have designed from the ground up begin to function as you imagined it would, like watching a clock you've assembled begin to keep time, the gears you cut and fitted turning exactly as you planned them. Our first contracted client was a manufacturing firm in Morley, a medium-sized operation making precision components for the automotive sector. The owner, a man named Gerald Thornton, who was in his 60s and deeply suspicious of anyone without 30 years of industry experience, had been skeptical. Simon had charmed him at the initial meeting. I had followed up with a proposal document so thorough, so carefully tailored to the specific inefficiencies in Gerald's current maintenance arrangement, that he had called us back within a week. "Whoever wrote this knows what they're talking about," Gerald had said over the phone. Simon had taken the call. I'd heard about it afterward, when Simon came home and told me about it with the bright energy of a man reporting his own success. I had said nothing. I was used to the way credit moved in that space. Within 2 years, we had 11 contracted clients and a turnover of 280 €. Within 4 years, we had 23 clients, and I had recruited our first full-time bookkeeper, a meticulous woman named Helen, who lasted 7 years with us and who was worth 3 times what we paid her. By 2005, Hartwell Industries had a genuine reputation in the sector, referenced by clients to their peers, which was the highest form of endorsement in that particular industry. Simon's name was on the letterhead. Simon's name was in the room. And the reason the company delivered on what Simon's name promised was sitting at a desk in the spare bedroom of our house in Alwoodley, reviewing contracts and tracking payments and making sure that the beautiful promises had the operational substance to back them up. I signed one legitimate amendment to the shareholder agreement in 2004, transferring 10% of my shares to Simon in acknowledgement of his management role. It felt fair at the time. He was running the day-to-day. I was raising our children and supporting the company from a distance. 50-50 felt right for what we'd built together. I signed it, filed it, and got on with things. I didn't know then that I'd never sign another company document again. I didn't know that the next set of signatures on Hartwell Industries paperwork would not be mine. The 2006 cash flow crisis deserves more than a passing mention, because it was the moment that most clearly illustrated both what I was capable of and what I had become invisible to. 2 anchor clients, one of them Gerald Thornton, who had retired and whose son had taken over the business and immediately switched to a national provider, departed within 11 weeks of each other in the autumn. The combined effect was catastrophic. We lost nearly 40% of contracted revenue in a quarter, at a point when our operating costs had scaled to match a healthier income level. Simon's response was panic, which I understood, and then a kind of frenetic doubling down on new client acquisition, which was his instinct, and in some ways the right instinct. You can't cut your way to health. You have to replace the revenue, but which, without the structural support to keep existing obligations alive in the meantime, would not have been enough. I spent 3 weeks that autumn on the phone and in meetings with our existing suppliers and subcontractors, renegotiating payment terms, extending credit periods, building goodwill through honest conversation about our temporary position. I restructured our invoicing cycle so that payment milestones aligned better with our costs. I identified 4 clients whose contracts were coming up for renewal and personally handled the renewal conversations, building in rate increases that were modest enough not to drive defections, but meaningful enough to improve our margins. I found 47,000 in recoverable efficiency savings within our operating model that had been accumulating quietly for 2 years because nobody had looked at the numbers carefully enough. By December, the company was stable. Not thriving, but stable. The bleeding stopped, the core intact, with a realistic path back to growth. Simon spent that period on the road, pursuing new contracts with the relentless energy that was his genuine gift. And by the following spring, we had replaced both lost clients and added 3 more. At the company Christmas dinner that December, Simon gave a speech about resilience and the importance of hard work, and the team that had gotten them through a difficult year. He thanked his sales staff. He thanked his operations manager. He thanked Helen, the bookkeeper. He thanked me, briefly, as my wife Claire, who has always kept the home fires burning. I raised my glass. I smiled. I kept the home fires burning all right. We married in 2003. I took his name, Claire Hartwell. And somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of life, 2 children, a mortgage in Alwoodley, school runs and dinner parties, and the 10,000 small tasks of a household and a family, I stepped back from the visible parts of Hartwell Industries and became what everyone saw me as, Simon's wife. The woman in the background, the woman with that helpful energy. It happens gradually. That's the thing nobody ever quite tells you. How gradual the erasure is. How it moves in increments so small that each one is individually invisible, so that by the time you begin to notice, you have already traveled a very considerable distance from where you started. There is no single morning when you wake up and realize you have become invisible. There are only the small decisions, the practical accommodations, the reasonable arrangements that compound over time into something you did not choose but cannot quite identify the moment of having entered. When our first child, Thomas, arrived in 2001, I reduced my active involvement in the company to roughly half what it had been. Still present, still essential, but no longer working from the office, no longer attending client meetings, no longer visible in the ways that confer professional identity. This was sensible. This was practical. We had a baby, and someone had to be primarily responsible for him. And since Simon was the one clients called by name, since Simon was the face that the sales pipeline relied on, it made operational sense for me to step back and for him to press forward. What I did not account for, what perhaps no one ever accounts for, is the way that stepping back from the visible parts of something tends to be permanent, even when you intend it as temporary. Each year I became a little less present in the office, a little more the person who organized things from a distance, a little more the woman who came in for specific problems and left when they were resolved. By the time our daughter Sophie was born in 2004, and the 10% share transfer happened in the same year, the pattern was already so established that neither decision felt like a threshold. They felt like continuations of something already in motion. I told myself during those years that I remained centrally involved. And in some real sense I did. The crises that came to me were the structural ones, the financial ones, the ones that required the specific kind of thinking that built the company in the first place. But involvement without visibility is not the same thing as presence. You can be indispensable to something and simultaneously invisible within it. And visibility, I came to understand far too late, is not merely vanity. It is record. It is the accumulated testimony of your existence in a space, the daily evidence that you were there and that what you did mattered. When you are not visible, the record can be rewritten. The quarterly meeting was on a Thursday morning in February. I know the exact date. I know the exact time. 10:47 in the morning. Because I'd been at the building since 9:15 trying to help sort out a catering delivery that had been mislabeled and sent to the wrong floor. Simon had called me the evening before, slightly frantic, because one of the board members, a man named Jeffrey Marsh, who ate only very particular things and was not shy about saying so, had dietary requirements that the original caterer had missed. And could I possibly come in early and sort it out? I came in early. I sorted it out. I'd gone down to collect the replacement pastries myself, because the catering company's driver was circling the industrial estate with no idea where to park. I'd found him, guided him in, helped bring the trays up. The catering staff were still setting up when the meeting was due to start. Someone needed to bring the coffee service into the conference room. I want you to understand what I was wearing when I walked through that door. A charcoal blazer from Rice, silk blouse, my good earrings, the ones my mother had given me. My hair was done. I had driven 40 minutes from Alwoodley to sort out a catering problem at my husband's company on a cold February morning. And I had done it with care. And I walked into that conference room carrying a silver coffee service, looking, by any reasonable measure, like exactly what I was. A professional, accomplished, 52-year-old woman. There were 47 people in that room. I knew the majority of them. I'd met Jeffrey Marsh's wife at a charity function 3 years earlier. I'd once helped David Cartwright from accounts reconstruct a financial report after his laptop died the night before a presentation. I'd sat across a dinner table from Natasha Wells, the head of operations, and listened to her talk about her daughter's university applications while I offered advice I'd gathered from my own experience with my eldest. Simon was at the head of the table. He was mid-sentence when I came in, making some point about Q4 projections. He glanced up, and there it was. "Ah, here's the Maid. Just set it down anywhere, love. Don't worry about understanding what we're discussing." My hands did not shake. I need you to know that. My hands were perfectly steady. The silence lasted 3 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. The way you count lightning after thunder, measuring the distance between the strike and the damage. And then Jeffrey Marsh laughed. And that was all it took. Because once Jeffrey Marsh laughed, the whole table had permission, and the whole table used it. Board members, department heads, David Cartwright, who had sat in our kitchen while I helped him reformat 7 pages of financial data. Natasha Wells, who had looked at me across my own dinner table like I was a person worth knowing. All of them laughing. I noticed in that sustained, horrible moment how quickly the laughter moved around the table. Not everyone laughed with the same conviction. Some people, and I could see this, because I was watching carefully in the way you watch when the world is showing you something you need to see. Some people glanced around first, checking the register, calibrating their response to the responses of others. They laughed because not laughing would have required a kind of moral courage that the social architecture of that moment made expensive. It would have required them to contradict the man at the head of the table, to signal solidarity with the woman carrying the tray, to identify in public which side of this moment they were on. It was cheaper to laugh. And so they did. I set down the coffee service. I did not look at Simon. I walked out of the conference room with the same measured step I had walked in with, and I moved down the corridor toward the ladies' toilets at the far end of the building, and I locked myself in a cubicle, and I stood there in the dark with my back against the cold metal door. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that too. What I felt was not grief, and it was not humiliation, though those things were present. What I felt, standing in that locked cubicle with my hands finally beginning to tremble slightly, was clarity. The specific, terrible clarity of understanding that something you suspected to be true is actually definitively true. That the pattern you've been making excuses for is not a pattern of misunderstanding. It is a pattern of design. I thought about the Christmas party, December, 18 months before, a function at one of the city center hotels. I'd worn a deep blue dress that I'd spent $340 on and 3 weeks hunting for. I'd felt, getting ready that evening, like myself. Like the version of myself that existed before the children, before the stepping back. The capable, polished version that had once built business plans and restructured supplier contracts. I'd arrived with Simon, and within 20 minutes, we'd been separated by the usual pull of the room, and I'd found myself near the bar when a young woman in a company lanyard had appeared at my elbow. "Could you grab a few of these bottles and bring them to the second table? We're running low." She'd gestured at the wine, just the whites. I'd looked at her. I'd said gently that I wasn't with the venue staff, that I was Simon Hartwell's wife. And she'd laughed. A pretty, embarrassed little laugh. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. You just have that. You have such a helpful energy," I assumed. I'd laughed along with her. I'd told her not to worry. I'd been gracious about it because being gracious was what I did. And I'd moved away from the bar with a glass of wine I didn't particularly want, and spent the rest of the evening wondering why being mistaken for staff felt familiar in a way that a genuine mistake should not. The phrase stayed with me. Helpful energy. I had turned it over during the drive home, Simon talking about the evening beside me, and I had tried to locate the discomfort it left, and couldn't quite manage it. It slipped away from me, the way things do when you're not quite ready to look at them directly. Standing in that toilet cubicle in February, I looked at it directly. The helpful energy was real. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what it had come to mean. Not a quality I possessed, but a role I had been assigned. An identity so thoroughly attached to usefulness and service that it had obscured every other thing I was. The woman who sorted out the catering. The woman who remembered the dietary requirements. The woman who came in on cold February mornings to manage logistics that nobody else wanted to manage, and who walked into rooms carrying silver coffee services and was therefore, by the most reductive and brutally efficient logic, the help. I thought about 2019, when the company's client database system crashed so catastrophically that 3 years of correspondence and contract histories were unrecoverable from the server backup. Simon had called me at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, in a state I hadn't heard him in since the 2006 cash flow crisis. I'd gone in. I'd spent 3 weeks working 16-hour days, going through email archives, physical filing systems, client communication records, rebuilding 12 years of data by hand. I'd done it methodically, carefully, with the same discipline my grandmother had applied to saving money, one piece at a time, never cutting a corner, trusting that the process would deliver if you respected it. The detail of those 3 weeks comes back to me with absolute clarity when I allow it. The office I worked in was a small room adjacent to the main administrative floor, with a window that faced the car park and a radiator that made a ticking sound every 20 minutes with the reliability of a clock. I was there before anyone else arrived and after everyone else left. I ate sandwiches at the desk. I drank too much coffee and too little water, and by the end of the second week, my eyes were dry from staring at screens and paper under fluorescent light. The thing about rebuilding a database from scattered source materials is that it requires a very specific kind of mind, not clever exactly, but systematic. You have to be able to hold a complex structure in your head, to understand how the pieces relate to each other, to recognize which fragment belongs to which record, to understand that a reference in a 2011 email to the Bridlington contract maps to a file with a different reference number in a physical folder from 2010. It's the kind of work that most people underestimate until they try to do it, and then abandon because the scale overwhelms them. I did not abandon it. I finished it, every record restored, every link reestablished, cleaner and better organized than it had been before the crash, because if I was going to do it at all, I was going to do it properly. When it was done, Simon had thanked me privately, at home, quietly, genuinely. And then at the next company meeting, he'd credited his assistant manager James with having salvaged the situation through extraordinary effort. I'd heard about it secondhand, mentioned in passing by a spouse at a social event. I hadn't said anything to Simon about it. I had filed it away in the same place I'd filed all the other things, in the cabinet in the back of my mind labeled, "Things that are strange, but which I am not ready to examine." Standing in that toilet cubicle, I unlocked that cabinet and looked at everything inside it. I stayed in there for 11 minutes. Then I washed my hands, checked my face in the mirror, and left the building. Barry, the security guard, was at his desk near the main doors when I came through the corridor. He looked up and gave me a small nod, the same nod as always, neutral and professional, the nod of a man who sees many people pass through and does not require any of them to be more than their function. I thought, Barry does not know who I am. He has never known who I am. In 7 years of my entering and leaving this building, he has never been given the information that would allow him to know, because the information was not considered relevant. I was Simon's wife, which in that building meant I was a category, not a person. I pushed open the heavy glass door and walked out into the February car park, and the cold closed around me like water. I stood beside my car for a moment with the key in my hand, looking at the building. Brown brick, modern, anonymous. A building that existed because a 29-year-old woman had a business plan and her grandmother's savings and the patience to do the invisible work that turns ideas into institutions. A building that contained 47 people who had just laughed at her. A building whose security guard did not know her name. I got in the car. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for perhaps 3 minutes. Then I started it and drove home, and I did not play the radio, and I did not call anyone, and I watched the road unroll ahead of me through the February gray, and I thought, with the particular clarity of a decision already made, this is the last morning I will be the woman who simply goes home. Something had changed. I could feel it in my chest, not a closing down, but an opening. Like a door that had been stuck had finally shifted on its hinges, and behind it was not darkness, but light, cold and clear and uncompromising. I drove home to Alwoodley, went directly to the study, and sat down at Simon's desk. I sat there for perhaps 20 minutes without doing anything at all, simply looking at the room. The filing cabinet in the corner, the shelves of business books Simon had accumulated over the years and rarely opened, the framed photographs, one of our wedding, one of the children at the beach in Cornwall, from the summer they were small enough to still find rock pools genuinely magical, one of Simon at some company function, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize against a backdrop of corporate signage. I looked at all of it, and I understood for the first time with any real clarity that this room, like the company it represented, like the marriage it was embedded in, had been organized around a version of me that served a particular function. I was the infrastructure. I was the system that ran in the background, invisible and essential, humming along behind the interface that everyone else interacted with. And the interface, I was beginning to understand, had a very different story about who had built it. The following Monday, I drove back to the building. I had keys. I'd always had keys. Simon had never seen any reason to remove them, because why would he? The maid didn't need to be locked out. I walked past reception. The security guard, a quiet man named Barry, who had worked there for 7 years and who I had once brought homemade biscuits for Christmas, nodded at me the way he'd nod at someone delivering the post. I went to Simon's office. He looked up from his computer. "Could you grab me lunch from Pret?" he said. Usual order. And here's the thing about the usual order. I knew it. I knew it without thinking. The specific sandwich, the specific crisps, the specific drink. I'd fetched it or organized its fetching dozens of times over the years in exactly the same way I'd organized the Christmas cards and the dinner parties and the catering corrections on cold February mornings. And this time, for the first time, I heard myself knowing it, and I heard the 11 years of assumption built into his asking, the absolute certainty that I would do this unquestioningly, and something in my spine straightened. "No," I said. "I can't do that." Simon's face moved through several expressions very quickly. Confusion arrived first, genuine and unguarded, because the request was so habitual, so unremarkable, that my refusal landed as something close to nonsensical. Then irritation came behind it, and behind the irritation, something sharper. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I'm not fetching your lunch. I'm your wife, not your assistant." He looked at me as though I were someone he'd met briefly at a party and couldn't quite place. There was a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and rang down to his actual assistant, explained in a put-upon tone that the usual help isn't being particularly helpful today, arranged his lunch through the correct channel, and dismissed me with a gesture so practiced, so automatic, that I understood he had been doing it without thinking for years. I drove home, and I went to the filing cabinet. Simon was many things, but organized was not among them. For 23 years of marriage, I had managed our personal paperwork because if I had not managed it, it would not have been managed. Tax returns, insurance policies, mortgage documents, correspondence, all of it lived in a 4-drawer filing cabinet in our study, sorted and labeled and cross-referenced, because that was what I did. Simon occasionally remembered documents existed when he needed them, called for them, received them from me, and returned them to wherever he happened to be standing. I worked through the cabinet methodically: marriage certificate, house deeds, insurance, children's school records, and then, at the back of the bottom drawer, in a manila folder labeled Hartwell Original Docs, in handwriting I recognized as mine from a very long time ago, I found a document that made the entire world shift slightly on its axis. The original Articles of Incorporation for Hartwell Industries, Limited, filed March 1998. I spread them on the desk and read every word slowly, and I found 2 names under directors and shareholders: Simon Hartwell, director, and Claire Hartwell, not Morrison, not yet, we hadn't married, listed as primary shareholder and co-founder. That was my signature at the bottom of the page. Young and confident and slightly too large, the way signatures are when you're 29 and signing something that feels important and permanent. I remembered writing that signature. I remembered the Prosecco in the solicitor's car park. I sat with it for a moment, understanding what it meant. Then I kept digging. The original shareholder agreement, March 1998. My 45 Walland, Simon's 12 Walland. 60% to me, 40% to him. Clear, formal, legally binding. I read it twice. Then I found the 2004 amendment. The legitimate one, the one I remembered. The 10% transfer. Claire Hartwell to Simon Hartwell, in recognition of management contributions. My real signature, mature and certain, exactly as I remembered writing it. Then I found a document from 2009. It was a share transfer agreement. 23% of shares, from Claire Hartwell to Simon Hartwell. My name at the bottom. My signature, or something very close to my signature. I stared at it for a long time, feeling something cold moving slowly through my chest. I did not remember this document. I did not remember signing it. I did not remember anyone discussing it with me. I found papers from 2012, another transfer. From 2015, another. From 2017, another still. Each one carried my name. Each one moved shares from me to Simon. I laid them out on the desk in chronological order and sat back and looked at them. And I did the arithmetic. And I understood that according to these documents, I currently owned 8% of the company I had funded into existence with my grandmother's life savings. The arithmetic was not difficult. It was devastating. 60% minus 10 in 2004, minus 23 in 2009, minus 11 in 2012, minus 5 in 2015, minus 3 in 2017, 8%. The number sat on the page with the flat finality of a closed door. 8% of a company I had designed, funded, restructured, salvaged, and sustained across 26 years. 8% of Elsie's savings, Elsie's seamstress hours, Elsie's reckoning book. 8% of a business that my grandmother's faith in me had made possible. I put my hand on the desk and held it there until it steadied. I took photographs of everything on my phone. Every page, every document, every signature. I put the originals back in their folders and the folders back in the drawer, and I closed the cabinet and I sat at the desk for a long time with my hands folded in my lap, thinking about what 8% meant, and thinking about what 50% meant, and thinking about the gap between those two numbers and what must have crossed that gap. I thought about the specific year 2009, when the first fraudulent document was dated. What had I been doing in 2009? Thomas was 8, Sophie was 5. I had been running the school run and organizing the summer holiday and attending Thomas's swimming club on Saturday mornings and managing the household finances and dealing with a complicated insurance claim when the boiler flooded the kitchen in March. And somewhere in between all of that, I had apparently been signing away nearly a quarter of my stake in a company I had funded into existence. Except that I had not. Someone else had signed my name. Someone had taken my signature, the signature of a 29-year-old woman standing in a car park with a bottle of Prosecco, and used it to delete me. I thought about who had done this. I thought about sitting across from Simon at dinner tables and holiday meals and parents' evenings and company functions for the years since 2009, and I tried to locate, in those memories, some evidence of guilt or discomfort or the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who knows they have done something they should not have. I could not find it. What I found instead, looking backward through those years with new clarity, was a pattern of small maneuvers that I had always read as personality and now read as strategy. The gentle discouragement of my curiosity about company financials, the vague and heavy way he spoke about complexity whenever the business came up, the automatic assumption that I would sort out the domestic logistics while he handled the professional ones, the absolute certainty, embedded in every interaction, that I would not look too carefully, would not press too hard, would not open the filing cabinet and read what was inside it. He had not been wrong for a very long time. I sat with that for a moment. I allowed myself to feel it, not as self-reproach, because blame distributed inward is wasted, but as information. He had bet on my not looking, and I had not looked, and this was true, and it was now finished. It was finished because I was looking now, at everything. with the undistracted attention of someone who has finally understood that the documents on the desk are the only version of events that the world can verify. Then I went and made myself a cup of tea, because some habits are too deeply ingrained to abandon. And I sat at the kitchen table with it cooling in front of me, and I called my university friend Rachel, who is a solicitor's clerk and knows everyone in her field in Leeds, and I told her I needed a referral. She gave me Patricia Chen's number without hesitation. "Corporate law and fraud," Rachel said. "She's the best there is. Don't let Simon find out you're going." I called Patricia's office the next morning. I had an appointment within 48 hours. Patricia Chen operated from an office on East Parade, 7th floor, overlooking the city center. She was in her mid-40s with short dark hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the manner of someone who had heard every variety of legal problem twice and was not surprised by any of them. She offered me a seat and coffee and took neither for herself, and she began reading from the moment I laid the first document on her desk. She read for 90 minutes. She occasionally made notes in a small, neat hand. She asked 3 questions during that time, calm, precise questions about dates and contexts, and wrote down my answers. When she looked up at the end, her expression was not horrified or disbelieving. It was professional, and it was hard, and it told me she had seen things like this before. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "do you remember signing any document related to share transfers after 2004? "No, not one." She placed one finger on the papers from 2009. "Because these signatures are forgeries, good ones. Someone studied your genuine signature carefully, but handwriting changes over time. And yours changed between 2004 and 2007. You can see it clearly if you compare these." She pointed to a tax return I'd signed in 2008, then back to the 2009 transfer. "The loop in your capital C, the way you complete the double L in Hartwell. The later document still uses the pre-2007 style. Your genuine signatures from 2008 onward have a slightly different characteristic. This is a forged signature from someone working off an older sample." The room tilted. I put my hand flat on the desk to steady myself without thinking about it. He forged my signature. Multiple times, over multiple years. According to the documents as they currently stand, you own 8% of Hartwell Industries. According to the legitimate documentation, the original agreement, and the one valid amendment, you own 50%. I thought about Simon's new Audi, the one he'd purchased the previous spring, 67 Zellers. "Treated myself," he'd said, with a wave of his hand that suggested the figure was incidental. I thought about the company retreat to Portugal that had apparently been a necessary leadership development investment. I thought about the offhand way he'd mentioned over dinner 8 months ago that the company was probably worth $2, $3 million if they ever decided to sell. "But you know how it is, Claire. These things are complicated," said with a slight heaviness that invited me not to engage further, and I had not engaged further because I had learned over years that there were parts of Hartwell Industries in which my curiosity was gently discouraged. "There's something else," Patricia said. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk. "I pulled your company's filed accounts. Hartwell Industries has been declaring significantly higher profits than what appears on your joint tax returns. Either there's a reporting error, which I can make go away for tax fraud as a theory, or your husband has been concealing company income from you. Potentially both scenarios are true simultaneously." I looked at the window. The Leeds skyline, gray February sky over the city I'd lived in my entire life. There was something almost peaceful about the clarity of it. "What do we do?" I said. "We build the case," said Patricia Chen. "And then we take it apart, piece by piece." The following 3 weeks were the most purposeful I had felt in years. Patricia brought in a forensic accountant named Roger Whitfield, a precise man with rimless glasses who spoke about financial discrepancies the way a doctor discusses test results, calm, factual, clinical. He found 7 years of irregularities. Dividends paid exclusively to Simon despite my ownership stake. Undeclared profit distributions. Income reported to Company's House at one level and to HM Revenue and Customs at another. He quantified it. At least $340,000 over the period that should, by rights, have come to me. Roger was the kind of professional whose ordinariness was itself a kind of authority. He wore the same sort of gray suit every time I met him, carried a briefcase that had clearly been in service for many years, and spoke in careful, measured sentences that contained no unnecessary words. Listening to him describe what he'd found was like listening to an engineer describe a structural failure, not with drama, but with the calm precision of someone who understands exactly what went wrong and why the building fell. He had created a spreadsheet that laid out, column by column, year by year, the divergence between what I should have received and what I had actually received. The total at the bottom of the column grew each time he updated it. By the end of the 3rd week, it had reached $340,000, and Roger had said, setting his pen down on the table with a small, deliberate click, that this was a conservative estimate. There was one afternoon, midway through the investigation, when I drove to my mother's house in Headingley. She was 81 by then, slower than she had been, but with the same essential quality of attention that had made her an excellent teacher for 31 years. The ability to listen without flinching, to hear difficult things without arranging her face into expressions that required management. I had not told her everything. I had said there were some complications with the company, that I was looking into them with legal help, and she had nodded and made tea and not pressed me for more than I was ready to give. That afternoon, I told her the whole of it. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had marked papers at night while we slept, the same table where she had told us, quietly, when our father's back injury ended his work, that we would be fine, and had meant it. And I told her about the documents and the signatures and the 340, Soren, and the email that Patricia had found, and she listened all the way through without saying a word. When I finished, there was a short silence. "Your grandmother Elsie," she said, "always said that the people who keep the books have the power if they choose to use it." I hadn't heard that before. I didn't know Elsie had said it. I sat with it for a moment, the image of a 16-year-old girl who became a seamstress and kept a reckoning book with gold corners, who understood long before I did that a record kept is a truth preserved. "I'm keeping the books now," I said. My mother nodded once, satisfied, and refilled my tea. Patricia located the original witnesses to the 1998 incorporation. One of them, a woman named Judith, who had been a paralegal at the original solicitor's office and was now retired to Harrogate, remembered the day clearly. She remembered me because I had been the one with the business plan, the one who had asked the careful questions, the one who had clearly done the work. She remembered Simon as charming but peripheral. She agreed to provide a witness statement. Patricia submitted formal disclosure requests to Simon's legal team. His solicitor, a man named Colbert who I'd met at a charity auction 2 years earlier and who had Simon's easy confidence without Simon's charm, sent over a stack of company documents in response, apparently assuming this was some routine marital administration. He sent board minutes, financial statements, the shareholder registry, articles of association. He also sent emails, all relevant correspondence, as the disclosure requirements stated. Thousands of emails, dumped into a file transfer, presumably because sorting them would have taken time Colbert didn't want to spend on what he imagined was a manageable situation. Patricia read them all. She read them with the systematic patience of someone who understands that the answer is in there if you look carefully enough, and she found what she was looking for in a thread from January 2015. She didn't tell me what was in it immediately. She told me to come to her office before the tribunal hearing, that she had something to show me. I drove into Leeds city centre on a grey morning 6 weeks after we'd filed with Company's House, and Patricia poured me coffee and slid a printed email across the desk. I read it once, then I read it again. Attached are the updated shareholder transfer docs. Simon had written to his accountant on a Tuesday morning in January 2015, while I had presumably been at home managing our household and our children and the invisible architecture of his life. I've signed Claire's name. She never reads these anyway. Just file them with the usual paperwork and make sure the dividend payments reflect the new percentages. What she doesn't know won't hurt her. What she doesn't know won't hurt her. I read it a third time. I set the paper down. I looked at Patricia Chen across her desk, and I said very calmly, "Shall we go?" The Business and Property Court's hearing room was oak-paneled and smelled of old books and something underneath that I can only describe as the smell of consequence. The kind of room where things are decided, where documentation becomes outcome, where the gap between what happened and what can be proven closes or doesn't. A tribunal judge, 2 panel members with corporate law backgrounds, a stenographer in the corner. Our legal team on one side, Simon's on the other. Simon was already seated when I entered. He'd worn a navy suit that I recognized. I'd been with him when he bought it 3 years ago, from a tailor on Brigate. He looked composed. He looked confident. He had the particular ease of a man who expects the world to arrange itself in his favor, because it usually had, because he was charming and plausible, and the front of things generally worked out. He didn't look at me when I sat down. I looked at him steadily for a moment, then looked away, because I did not need him to confirm anything anymore. Patricia built our case with the methodical calm of someone constructing something load-bearing. She laid out the original incorporation documents and the legitimate shareholder agreement. She walked the panel through the forensic handwriting analysis. Roger Whitfield had brought in a specialist, a woman who had testified in 12 previous fraud cases, who explained with quiet authority the specific characteristics that distinguished my genuine signatures from the forged ones, the loops and angles that betrayed a hand working from an outdated sample. She presented the financial records, the 7 years of discrepancies, the dividend payments that had gone to Simon alone. She called Judith from Harrogate, who explained clearly and without drama that she remembered the 1998 incorporation and remembered who had brought the capital and the business plan. Each witness was calm. Each piece of evidence was placed precisely where it needed to be. I watched Patricia work with the appreciation of someone who recognizes craftsmanship in their own field, the way she anticipated counterarguments and preempted them, the way she paced the presentation so that each piece of evidence landed with full weight before the next arrived, the way she addressed the panel members directly and without performance, trusting the materials to do the work that materials this clear would inevitably do. Simon's barrister, a tall man named Addison with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to winning, argued that I had willingly signed all transfer documents and simply didn't remember that 2 decades was a long time and memory was unreliable, that I had been largely uninvolved in company operations and was now, in the context of a deteriorating marriage, attempting to manufacture a claim on assets I had no genuine role in building. He was good. He was persuasive. I watched the panel's faces as he spoke and felt, for a moment, the old familiar tightening in my chest, the muscle memory of the woman who had taught herself to make space for dismissal. Then Patricia said, "I'd like to present Exhibit 17. She slid the paper to the judge. The room was very still. The judge read it aloud, as procedure required. Her voice was measured and professional, and absolutely without inflection, and what that absence of inflection did was strip away every possible cushioning from the words, leaving them bare and irreducible. Attached are the updated shareholder transfer docs. I've signed Claire's name. She never reads these anyway. Just file them with the usual paperwork and make sure the dividend payments reflect the new percentages. What she doesn't know won't hurt her." She put the paper down. The silence in that courtroom was nothing like the silence in the conference room. This silence had weight. This silence had direction. It moved from the judge to the panel members, to the stenographer, and from there to Simon's barrister. who was shuffling papers in the specific way of someone who understands that the architecture of their argument has just collapsed but is still going through the motions because there is nothing else to do. And then I looked at Simon. All the confidence had left him, not gradually, suddenly, completely, the way a candle goes out. His color had drained. His posture, which had been expansive and certain, had folded inward. He was staring at the paper in the judge's hands with the expression of a man who had genuinely believed until this precise moment that somehow it would not come to this, that some combination of charm and legal maneuvering and the abiding human tendency to believe what confident people tell them would prevent the document from mattering. He had miscalculated. The email was from his company account. It was attached to actual Companies House filings that had been submitted in its wake. It was, in his own words, an admission of exactly what we were there to prove. There was no version of events in which that email was explainable. There was no innocent interpretation. There was no misunderstanding. He had written those words, and he had meant them, and the woman he had decided never reads these anyway was sitting across the room from him, having read everything very carefully indeed. Addison attempted something in response. A suggestion that the email had been taken out of context, that the phrase, "signed Claire's name," might refer to some authorized signing arrangement, that corporate correspondence was often ambiguous. The judge listened with the polite attention of someone who has already made a decision and is allowing process to complete itself. She stopped him after 6 minutes. The deliberation took 20 minutes. I sat in the corridor outside the hearing room and drank terrible coffee from a paper cup and watched people move through the building, going about the ordinary business of ordinary days, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, quiet. Not empty, not numb. Quiet in the way a well-made thing is quiet, the hum of something working properly, the deep, undramatic stillness of a mechanism that has reached its correct configuration. I thought about Elsie's reckoning book. I thought about Mrs. Fairbrother and the students who got credit for my answers. I thought about Gerald Thornton saying, "Whoever wrote this knows what they're talking about." I thought about 3 seconds of silence and 47 people who chose laughter. I sat with all of it, and I did not feel angry, and I did not feel sad, and I did not feel vindicated in the loud, triumphant way that stories sometimes promise you will feel when the moment comes. I felt accurate, like a number that has been corrected, like a record that has been set right. The judge's ruling was delivered in the careful, precise language of the law, but the substance of it was as clear as February daylight. I was the legitimate 50% owner of Hartwell Industries, Limited. All share transfers after 2004 were void, having been executed by forgery. Simon Hartwell had committed fraud by forgery and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. The shareholder registry was to be corrected immediately. Simon was to repay $340,000 in diverted dividends, plus 7 years of interest for a total of $398,750. The matter was referred to the Serious Fraud Office for potential criminal prosecution. Legal costs, every penny of Patricia's $47,300, were to be paid by Simon. Patricia was professional in her satisfaction, which is to say, she allowed herself a single precise nod and squeezed my hand briefly as we gathered our papers. In the corridor outside the room, Simon tried to speak to me. I honestly can't tell you what he said first. Something about destruction, about unreasonableness, about how this was all a terrible misunderstanding and his accountant had interpreted things wrongly, which was a claim so bewildering in its audacity. Given the email, given the explicit and specific instructions in the email, that it registered as a kind of noise rather than language. I do remember the moment he stopped talking and looked at me, waiting for a response. The familiar pause, the beat where I was supposed to soften things, to manage the atmosphere, to be helpful. His eyes had a quality I'd seen before in difficult moments, not remorse, but appeal. The specific appeal of someone who has always been able to rely on the person in front of them to make things easier. I looked at him for a long moment, and I said, "You have no idea who you're talking to." Not loudly, not with anger, because anger was not what I felt. What I felt was simply true, simply clear, the way the sky is clear after a week of rain. I looked at Simon Hartwell, the man I had married and funded and supported and been dismissed by for 26 years, and I told him the only thing left worth saying, that he had spent the better part of 3 decades assuming he knew exactly what I was, and he had been wrong about every single part of it, and I was done accommodating that assumption. Then I walked past him to the lifts. Hartwell Industries went into administration 6 weeks after the tribunal ruling. It turned out, and this surprised me less than it might have, given everything, that the company's financial position was considerably less stable than Simon had represented. When you correct a fraudulent shareholder registry, add $398,750 in immediate legal debt to the balance sheet, and remove the confident assertion of a man who has been managing perceptions rather than finances, what you find underneath is a business that has been living beyond its means for several years. The administrators were brought in on a Monday morning in late spring. They sold the assets over the following months: industrial contracts, equipment, client relationships, the intellectual property of 28 years of operations. The sale realized $8 million. After company debts, after the tribunal judgment, after the administration costs, I received $634,000 as the primary shareholder of record. Simon received significantly less. I know the figure. I have chosen not to dwell on it. The Serious Fraud Office did prosecute. Simon's legal team negotiated a plea agreement over the autumn. 18-month suspended sentence, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent notation on his professional record that will follow him to every future business endeavor, every directorship application, every credit assessment for the remainder of his career. The kind of notation that closes doors before they can be opened. I did not attend his sentencing hearing. I had a meeting that morning with an investment advisor, a woman named Helen, who had been recommended by Patricia Chen, and we sat together in an office in the city center and talked about what $634,000 looked like as a foundation rather than an endpoint, and what kind of future you build with resources and expertise and a very clear understanding of your own worth. I want to tell you something about that investment meeting, because it matters in a way I didn't entirely expect. Helen asked me, early on, to describe my background, not Simon's background, mine. And I told her about the business administration, about the years of financial organizing and contract management, about rebuilding the client database, about the original business model for Hartwell Industries that I had built when I was 29 years old. And she listened with the attention of someone who is genuinely interested, and when I finished, she said, "You've been doing consultancy-level work for 20 years without calling it that." I had not thought of it in those terms. I had thought of it as being helpful, as being the woman with helpful energy. "You should consider formalizing that," Helen said simply. "You have a skill set. You should get paid for it." I left that meeting with a structured investment plan and something I hadn't expected, a sense of forward motion that had nothing to do with recovering what had been lost and everything to do with what might still be built. I drove home through the city center in the early afternoon light, and I thought about the 29-year-old woman who had once sat in a solicitor's office with a business plan and a grandmother's savings and a signature worth more than anyone in that room had acknowledged. I thought about what she would make of me now, older, harder, considerably wiser, and in possession of a very clear understanding that the work she had always done was the work that built things, that the invisible infrastructure was the only kind that lasted, and that the woman who keeps the records is, in the end, the only person who can prove what actually happened. 6 months after the tribunal ruling, I registered a consultancy, Morrison Advisory, Morrison being my grandmother's surname, my mother's maiden name, the name I had carried before I signed it away, along with everything else in a solicitor's car park, with a bottle of Prosecco and a great deal of hope. The name felt like a restoration. Not a return to before exactly, because you cannot return to before. You can only bring forward the parts of before that were worth preserving and build something new with them. But a restoration of something important. The thread back to Elsie and her reckoning book, to my mother and her kitchen table discipline, to the 29-year-old woman who had done the work and known what she was doing. My first consulting client was a small manufacturing firm in Wakefield, not unlike the kind of business Hartwell Industries had served in its best years. The owner was a woman in her early 40s who had inherited the company from her father and who was struggling with the financial reporting structures he'd left behind, which had been adequate for a business half the current size and were now creating dangerous blind spots in her decision-making. She had been referred to me by Helen, the investment advisor, who had mentioned my background. I sat with the owner for 2 hours on my first visit, reviewing her accounts and her contract structures and her payment terms. And at the end of those 2 hours, I had identified 12 specific changes that would improve her cash flow, reduce her operational risk, and give her the visibility into her own business that she needed to make real decisions. She looked at the list and then at me, and she said, "How did you learn to see all this?" I thought about 6 years of business administration and 23 years of invisible infrastructure work and a filing cabinet at home and a solicitor named Patricia and a reckoning book with gold corners. "Practice," I said, "and keeping very good records." She hired me that day. Within the year, I had 7 clients. The consultancy turned a modest profit in its first full trading year. Helen called it a strong foundation. I called it a beginning. There is one more thing I should tell you, because it is not a small thing. I told my children. Thomas was 23 when the tribunal happened, Sophie 20. Old enough to understand, and I had always believed that the truth, told plainly and without performance, is a gift rather than a burden. That children who are protected from difficult truths are not protected but simply disarmed, sent into a world they are not equipped to navigate. I sat down with them separately, first Thomas and then Sophie, in the kitchen of the house in Alwoodley that I had kept in the divorce settlement. I told them the same story I have told you in the same plain language, without dressing it as heroism or as tragedy. Thomas listened in the careful, contained way he has always had, a quality I recognized from my own childhood, the eldest child attentiveness, the habit of taking things in and processing them before responding. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The company was always yours, wasn't it? Even when we thought it was Dad's." "Yes," I said. "In the beginning, more than anyone knew." Sophie cried, which did not surprise me because Sophie has always felt things with a directness that she will eventually learn to value even when it exhausts her. She cried, and then she was angry, and then the anger passed and she said, with a clarity I had not expected, "You should have told someone sooner. You should have had someone who knew." She was right. I had carried the invisible architecture alone for too long, believing that the carrying was the point, that competence demonstrated in silence was its own reward. What I had not understood, what I understand now, is that silence is only a strategy when you choose it. When it is imposed on you, gradually, incrementally, by a person who has calculated that your not knowing will cost you everything, it is not a strategy at all. It is a vulnerability. Tell someone. Keep the records. Know what you own. I have thought about that conference room. I have thought about it more times than perhaps it deserves, but I think I understand why I keep returning to it. 47 people in a room, and none of them, not one, pushed back. They laughed because Simon gave them permission, and they had no framework for doing otherwise, because the woman who had just walked through the door was carrying coffee and therefore was not a person who required a different framework. She was simply the help. I think about Natasha Wells, who had sat at my dinner table and talked about her daughter. I think about David Cartwright, who had sat in my kitchen while I rebuilt his financial report. I think about Jeffrey Marsh, who had laughed first. I wonder if any of them think about that morning now. I wonder if they understand that the woman they dismissed as furniture was the reason Hartwell Industries had existed at all. That her grandmother's savings and her business plan and her 16-hour days had built the foundation those 47 people had been employed on. I wonder if they understand that when the company collapsed, it collapsed in large part because the woman they'd dismissed had finally stopped being helpful and started being accurate. I think about my grandmother Elsie. She'd worked as a seamstress from 16, saved with absolute discipline, left money to the people she trusted with a faith that asked for nothing except that it be honored. I think about what it means to honor that kind of faith, not by spending carefully, though I intend to do that, by understanding what it represented, someone seeing in you a capability worth investing in, and refusing to let that understanding be erased. I don't carry coffee for anyone anymore. I don't sign documents without reading every word, every clause, every footnote. I have Elsie's reckoning book on my desk beside my own records. The brown leather one with the gold corners, the cramped and precise handwriting, the brief editorial comments that give it the quality of a conversation held across time. And beside it, I have a folder labeled, simply, Foundation, and in it are the original Hartwell Industries Incorporation papers that I kept after the administration, because they are the document that tells the most accurate version of the story. A 29-year-old woman with $45,000 and a business plan and a signature that was worth more than anyone in that company ever acknowledged. I look at both of them sometimes, Elsie's book and young Claire's signature, and I understand them as the same document, really. Two women who built something real, who kept careful records, who trusted that the truth preserved in a written page would outlast every version of events that someone else might prefer. When someone tries to dismiss me now, in a professional meeting, in a social setting, at a dinner where someone assumes I'm the wife and not the person with something worth hearing, I have a response, not loud, not performed, just clear and quiet and completely certain. It does not require anger to be effective. Anger is loud, and loud is easy to dismiss. Certainty is something else. Certainty is the voice of a person who has read every document, who keeps every record, who knows to the penny what she owns and to the hour what she built. Certainty is the one thing that nobody, however charming, can talk you out of once you have fully arrived at it. I say, you have no idea who you're talking to, and I mean every word of it, because I know exactly who I am now, and that knowledge was worth every difficult, clarifying, ultimately liberating moment of discovering just how wrong someone was about me. They thought I was the maid. They had no idea I was the owner. And the distance between those two things, that specific, enormous distance, is the thing that made all the difference when the time finally came to close it. Because the maid goes home. The maid sorts out the catering and carries the coffee and is thanked with a wave of a hand and does not appear in the minutes of the meeting. But the owner has a copy of every document. The owner built the building. And the owner, when she finally decides to stop carrying the coffee and start reading the paperwork, discovers that the truth was there all along, in a filing cabinet in a study, in a signature written by a 29-year-old woman who had no idea how much she would one day need to prove. Now let me tell you something that extends beyond Claire's story, because what happened to her is not as rare as we might like to believe. Research into marital economic abuse, and yes, that is the correct term for what Simon did, consistently shows that financial control and the deliberate erasure of a partner's economic identity is one of the most underreported forms of domestic harm. Studies suggest that in nearly 1 in 4 marriages where one partner holds primary financial control, the other partner has limited or no access to accurate information about household or business finances. We tend to think of this as a problem that affects people without resources or education, but Claire had both. What she had less of over time was the framework to name what was happening to her. The pattern she describes, the slow, incremental erosion of visibility, the displacement of credit, the accumulated small dismissals that normalize invisibility. is precisely how long-term economic manipulation works. It doesn't announce itself. It builds in the gaps between ordinary life. And the people most vulnerable to it are often those who are most capable, because their capability is the very thing that makes them useful to exploit. If you recognize any part of Claire's story, not the dramatic legal resolution, but the quiet everyday part, the part about being dismissed in your own spaces, about signatures you don't remember, about credit that lands elsewhere, please take that recognition seriously. The filing cabinet is worth opening. Patricia Chen exists in every city in the country. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this. Knowing who you are is not a small thing. It is, in the end, the only thing that nobody can forge. If this story moved you, and I hope it did, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find these stories, and these stories deserve to be found. Leave a comment and tell me what part of this landed hardest for you. Was it the conference room, the filing cabinet, the email? I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories like this one coming, stories about people who were underestimated and undercounted and who found their way back to themselves with extraordinary clarity. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. This community spans every time zone, and I'm genuinely curious about who's here with me tonight. And the video on your screen right now, don't skip it. I mean it. The next story involves an inheritance, a family secret that was kept for 31 years, and a single document found inside a Bible that changed everything for 3 generations of one family. You will not see the ending coming. I promise you that. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.